just had the 10-year anniversary of the '98 Jericho March, and really movements trying to re-energize and put this back in. I'm wondering, like, sort of like what you think is the state of the movement, you know, this much later. What have we accomplished? What do we need to do to make it better?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and my voice is, you know, a small one in a wider range of folks that are, you know, discussing this and trying to figure this out. I mean, I think, you know, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the Jericho March and also the 10-year anniversary of critical resistance. And I think both of those things emerging at the same time in 1998 is significant, and both of those things now celebrating their 10-year anniversary and trying to figure out, you know, next steps in the movements to abolish the prison industrial complex and the movements to free political prisoners is fitting, right? Because I think those things obviously go hand in hand, and I think we need to, you know, increasingly be able to see those struggles as interconnected. I think we've had, you know, looking specifically to political prisoners, we've had some really wonderful victories in terms of the folks who have got out in the last 10 years. So the Puerto Rican political prisoners who were released, not all of them, but the 11 who were released in the summer of 1999, Laura Whitehorn, Linda Evans, Susan Rosenberg, white anti-imperialist political prisoners who were also released in 99 and 2001. You know, these victories I think are tremendous. I think we've also had some really heavy losses. The folks who have died inside Rural Africa, I think, died in 1998, going all the way up to Bashir Hamid, who died just a few months ago in 2008. Richard Williams, who died in 2006 or 2005. You know, and several others, Albert Noah Washington. So we've had this really tremendous defeat and, you know, heart-wrenching losses of several political prisoners, and I haven't mentioned all of the ones who have died inside. You know, that I think is really is awful. It's hard to put into words that sense of loss that I feel, and that I hope we all feel at the fact that folks die inside, that the state is really able to claim its pound of flesh, and, you know, denying people even, you know, humanitarian release. I mean, Noah Washington was sick with cancer for a long time, and even on his deathbed, the state, you know, would rather have him die in prison than even spend his last night at home with family. So I think we need to, you know, we need to mourn these losses, we need to celebrate our victories, and I think we need to steel our resolve. And part of that is really being able to build the movements that people come from, that people came from, that people are a part of. I think it's so hard to support political prisoners in terms of, you know, you always need to visit, need to write, need to send money, and I think more folks, I would hope more folks would be doing that, but I think we also need to be able to transmit, you know, their stories, their messages, their lessons into the campaigns that we're a part of today, you know, not just for their release, but, you know, to really turn back the wave of reaction that I think their incarceration has brought about and has symbolized. So I think a lot of our work now is to, you know, build those bridges, you know, within the prison movement that I think is blossoming, you know, more in the past 10 years than it has since the 1970s. And within, you know, between the prison movement and all of its aspects and other social movements that are happening. I think, you know, I hope that the change at the end of the Bush regime will be a chance where people feel more hopeful and more inspired and more able to take action, and I think that's a lot of work that we need to be doing. The losses that we have is not just the folks who have died in prison, but folks like Veronza Bauer, who, you know, has been held several years past his mandatory release date. One of the things that I'm finding in my research on the 70s is this, you know, strategy of both from folks on the inside and folks on the outside of trying to draw attention to what's happening on the inside as a way of movement building, not just around prison issues, but in general. And I think there were some limitations to that. You know, drawing attention to things doesn't necessarily translate into people understanding them the way you want them to understand them. But I think something like, you know, Veronza's illegal incarceration, I mean, I think many of our political prisoners are being held illegally, but this is a step beyond that, someone held years past his mandatory release date. Just the fact that he's still inside, while at the same time we've had new political prisoners, and certainly the expanding targeting of earth and animal rights activists, sort of which people are dubbing the Green Scare, and the folks that have gone to prison for that, and the ability of the state to turn several of those folks into snitches to get, in an attempt to get longer sentences against the others, I think is quite damaging. And so I think that too, reminds us that we're not just talking about, quote unquote, like old relics from the 60s, we're talking about what a politics of repression does, right? Mm-hmm. And what a society of repression does, which is, attempts to bury the past, but attempts to continue that into the present, to erase the legacies of people's struggles in the present and to forestall them in the future. I think the role of informants, both paid by the state in the case of Eric McDavid and the others who were swindled by this, or set up by this police informant, or in the case of what the FBI called Operation Backfire in the Northwest, where several of the people who were arrested were turned into informants by threats. I think reminds us, I would hope, or I would argue, should remind us of our need to really think about the state and our relationship to the state, and to have an analysis of the state. I think all the focus on global capitalism is right, but we can't forget the state that's deploys the batons and death squads and secret police to make it happen. And so I think being informed about grand juries and political prisoners and incarceration, and having a sense of your rights and all of that, I think is a really important aspect of our movements, and I think is something that revolutionaries of earlier generations were made to understand, and I think we would do well to understand likewise. I think the Green Scares are really and a really urgent reminder of the need to take our enemy seriously, because the enemy does the same of us. I think it's a response to success. It's a response to the fact that groups like the Earth Liberation Front, or even above ground groups like Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, were the embarrassment that those groups caused to the state and big corporations, I think met with fierce response. But I think we need to meet that response with deeper and stronger and smarter resistance. And I think some of the work around the San Francisco 8 is a really good example of that. I mean, this is a case where the state is trying to prosecute and incarcerate 8 former Panthers, 2 of whom have been political prisoners for more than 30 years, 6 of whom have been community activists on the outside since their time in the Panthers. And this is an attempt to, try to bury Black Power, 30 plus years later. And I think the organizing that's been happening around that has been exactly the kind of, creative thinking and new ways of approaching, political prisoners in relation to community struggles that I think we need, that I think we need to expand. The heinous nature of the crime argument is one that the state has used often in denying parole. I mean, Herman Bell and Jalil Muntakim, 2 members of the San Francisco 8, the 2 members of the San Francisco 8 who have been political prisoners for 30 years, have been denied parole consistently on that grounds. And that's, it's more than a double sentence. It's a violation of the state's own regulations. Parole is supposed to be granted on your conduct in prison, because the sentence, the nature of your crime, or the sentence that you have, what you're charged for, that never changes. So to say, that this perfect prisoner can't be paroled because their crime was too serious is really to violate the judicial process, where the whole point of the judge setting a sentence is, that the person should get out at that time unless there's some reason not to. So I think, the state is attempting to keep people inside as long as possible. And I think we can see the really intense, ideology of repression that the state wants, is willing to pay all this money to keep, you know, old folks inside, or to keep young folks inside, rather than have them out in the streets as organizers, I think is quite telling. You know, that this is, you know, never purely or even primarily an economics issue, but about control and power and repression. So I think, you know, I think the parole denials are an attempt, are an assault, you know, on our movement's memory.